As usually, we'll walk through the new features or the improvements in the latest version of CloverDX, CloverDX 6.5, which we released about 3 weeks ago. So you are now able to download everything and play with everything that I'll be presenting today. As usually, I'll do a short presentation with slides, and then I'll show you a demo of the new features so that you can imagine a little bit better what they are instead of just looking at the slides. So a quick recap. We are still doing 4 releases a year, so this isn't changing, and we are now releasing the second release of the year, 6.5, and we'll be planning 6.6 in September and Clover 7 in December, just before the end of the year. When we look at the highlights of the latest release, CloverDX 6.5, we have one new feature, or huge new feature called Data Manager. This is an interesting thing that I'll explain in more detail, but it is essentially something that allows you to work with your data in completely new, different ways compared to what you've been able to do in Clover before, because it allows you to edit data directly rather than creating some sort of like a formula or description for what Clover should do with your data. You'll be able to directly edit your records as they go through. And as usually, there are many improvements throughout the product. We have several improvements in Wrangler. We've refreshed the look and feel of the data apps so that they align a little bit better with our style. We have made improvements in the aggregator component that makes it much easier to use in certain situations and much more powerful compared to the previous version. The clustering configuration is simpler, and we use that functionality to build Kubernetes examples that show you how you can deploy, for example, a cluster in Kubernetes very easily. And as usually, there are many smaller updates and security fixes. You can see the full list in our release notes on the website. Please consult that before the upgrade, especially for the issues that changed compatibility of the product compared to previous versions. So let's start with the Data Manager. This is a new part of CloverDX product that we are introducing in CloverDX 6.5. It is an incubation feature, so you can expect a lot more changes in there. You can already play with that. You can see what it is about, but it will be much better in the subsequent releases. When you think about what the Data Manager is, it's essentially a place for you to store data that requires manual intervention. This means that when you have a job that processes data in automated fashion, like usual in Clover, whether it's a Wrangler job or something that you built in Designer, oftentimes you come to a point where you need to do something with the data that cannot be automated easily, meaning that you have to edit records that are broken in some way or approve your data and so on. And this is something that you've been able to do in Clover before, but it required various workarounds and you had to go outside of the platform. This is no longer the case because Data Manager allows you to do just that. It's essentially a user interface for reviewing, editing, and approving data directly without having to use Excel spreadsheets or anything like that. So when you think about what the Data Manager enables you to do, it essentially allows us to get much closer to the data stewardship use case than we've been able to do before. And the data stewardship itself is about essentially helping organizations to deliver data and be confident in the data quality and consistency. And oftentimes it means that you have to properly take care of data quality, review the data as it goes through your system, and make sure that the people who are involved in the processing of your data know what it means and that everything makes sense. So there are 3 main use cases that we are focusing with Data Manager right now. The first now is what we call manual intervention into the data pipelines. That's essentially about reviewing your content, making sure that the data is correct, enriching the data in some way, approving the data, and pushing it further towards the end of your process. Then we'll be looking towards reference data management, or essentially management of your lookups. Typically, this is the data that's shared between multiple different use cases, like, for example, your product codes, regions, or all kinds of other things that are static and don't really change. And then finally, we are introducing something that we call CloverDX Data Store. This is more on the long-term side of the vision for Data Manager. It's essentially our own store for data as it is processed by Clover. So you will be able to use it for essentially anything where you need to keep data for longer than just temporary storage while the data is being processed by the platform. And again, this is something that I'll explain a little bit more as we go along. So typical use case for what we are doing with Data Manager right now is what we call the manual intervention. As I mentioned, this is something where you essentially have a process that starts with some sort of automated process. Right? So you read data from some source or from multiple sources, perform some calculations, validate it, enrich it with something. But there comes a point where the data can't be pushed through the rest of the process automatically. For example, some data might contain errors that cannot be fixed automatically, or your process requires approval. Even if the data is valid from the data point of view, it still needs someone to look at it and say this is fine. For example, the typical process that requires this is some sort of process involving invoices, especially higher invoices with different organizations having different thresholds for what's considered an invoice that requires an approval. So you have this manual step, and then of course there's further automated processing that gets data after the review or approval and does something with it. For example, writes to warehouse, calls an API or something like that. And this is something that you can do in Clover right now already, but it requires you to go outside of the platform. Essentially, you do the first part of the step or of the process in here, computing as much as you can in Clover, validating and so on. And then you typically write the data into something that's outside of Clover, whether it's an Excel file or an email or combination of both. And the people then who are supposed to review the data and approve it look in there, right? So they modify an Excel spreadsheet, upload it back when they are done and so on, and that resumes the further process. This, of course, is not hard to do, right? We have many customers who are doing a variant on this kind of process, but it's not something that you really want to be doing. It's relatively hard to keep this together, especially if you have a lot of people who need to be doing the manual part of the process. You need to make sure that, for example, the Excel files that they share are not broken in some way, that they don't override each other's changes and all of that. And it's completely outside of the control. And you are essentially building some sort of like shadow IT oftentimes that doesn't help keeping your data quality as good as you want, because you can't control the process very well. And obviously there are concerns around security and privacy. Anyone can copy an Excel file and forget it somewhere or send it by mistake to someone else. You typically have very limited user interface for this. While Excel is a very powerful tool, it's not something that you want to be using for editing of large amounts of data and so on. And so this is doable. Many customers are already doing that because they don't really have any other choice, and it works for them. But with Data Manager, what we want to achieve is much better. It's all in the platform. So you still have the beginning of the process exactly the same as before, but when there is time to review the data, instead of just writing it to a file or sending it by email or something like that, you write it to a data manager, which contains its own data store in the backend. The data manager contains user interface that allows you to work with your data directly. So you will be able to edit your records, see them, approve it, so on. And when you are ready, the ending parts of the process can pick up the data from the data manager store and continue with the processing, all within CloverDX. Nowhere you have to go into files that are outside of the platform. So this obviously has many benefits, right? One being that it's all within the platform. You have full control of the data lifecycle. You can have any number of jobs feeding your data into Data Manager, any number of jobs reading data from Data Manager at kind of like the end. You can use all the features of Clover in here, like lookups and so on. It contains permission management, so you can change who can, for example, edit your data, who can approve. You can change the visibility of data for different users and so on. And of course, this being a specific user interface made for just this kind of process, it's much more convenient than what you can do with Excel files, especially if you don't turn your Excel files into super complicated macros. Then just like naked Excel is much less powerful than what you can do in here. I'll show you what it looks like so that you can imagine what it is, and I'll use a simple demo for that about essentially data ingestion and data cleansing use case where the goal will be to read data about real estate. So it's information about properties like houses or land plots and so on, which says about size, price, location, and all kinds of other things you can expect when you are looking at a real estate deal. But this data often is incomplete or not really of good quality because people type it in into whatever application they have, and then you receive that, aggregate that, and publish on your website. So the first thing that you need to do is to read the data, do all the automated steps, for example, translate from the incoming format to your internal storage layout, enrich the data as much as you can. But for many records, you will not be able to fix them automatically. So you send them to Data Manager, which you can use then to manually review and approve the records or the data. And once it's done, the listings are clean and can be written, for example, into a data warehouse so that they can be later reported on or displayed on the website and so on. So this is the use case that I'll show in the designer in just a few minutes once we cover all the slides. So as a quick recap, when we think about CloverDX as a whole platform, we've been adding new interfaces over the last roughly 2 years that expand the usage of the platform to different kinds of users. And when you look at all the interfaces that the platform offers, on one hand, you have what I would call like the traditional data engineering interfaces like the designer, the server, or dashboard, marketplace, and so on. These are all interfaces that are aimed at technical users, data engineers who are creating the jobs. They can code, they can work with SQL, build databases, and all that stuff to make the data processes do what they need to. All of that is built on top of the server core, which supports running of automated data pipelines. There's an API that you can use, and many of these interfaces use the same API to communicate with the server backend. And over the last couple of years, we have built a second part of the product, or the other side, that aims at less technical users. So these are people who typically don't want to code, even if they can, and it's not their job to build data transformations in Designer, but rather they work typically with data directly. We have the self-service interface in Wrangler, data catalog that helps you manage your data sets, see what's there, data apps that help you trigger the processes that were built by technical teams in here, and the new interface that falls into this group as well. That's the data manager that allows you to work with your data directly without kind of having to program anything. You just edit your data right in place. And so we have full set of interfaces that allow you to, on one hand, create your jobs that do something with your data, all the way to editing your data manually so that you can affect single record rather than working with records as a group. So that's the data manager introduction, and I'll show you more details on the demo in a couple minutes. Let's go through the rest of the improvements in CloverDX. So there are quite a few of them. I'll start with the Wrangler. We've improved the mapping in the Wrangler job. So now what you can do is automatically convert between compatible types. The conversion table is in here. So these are the conversions that are supported automatically. It's essentially the conversions that are safe. So you are never losing any data when this happens automatically. Right, so what you do is you kind of grab your column from your data set and just drop it where you want. For example, the last row in here is mapping a date column into a string field in the output, and you don't have to have a special field or special column just to convert the date into a string. It does it for you automatically, and the same works for all these combinations above. So this will simplify many of your jobs because you don't have to have any extra columns in your data, just converting the types if you need both of them. Further, we've improved the preview for mapped targets. So once you have created your mapping, you can actually click on the last row in the steps list, right, on the target, and you will see the data as it looks like exactly when it goes to the target. This was not possible before. You always saw the data in the step before the mapping, but the mapping can change the layout, so now you can see that directly. This is something that will help you debug your transformations and see much better what data really gets to the target rather than having to essentially figure it out by yourself from the data produced by last step and what you have in the mapping. So just faster and easier to see the data, what it is and what it looks like. And final improvement in Wrangler is we've made improvements in the delete columns step. Now you have two modes of operation for the step. You can either delete the columns that you select or keep the columns that you selected. So this might seem a little bit strange to have a mode called keep in the delete component or in the delete step, but essentially it allows you to keep only the columns that you selected, which is helpful in many cases when you have a wide record with many columns and you only want to keep a handful of them. So for example, if you have 25 columns in your data set and you only need 5, instead of selecting 20 columns and deleting them, you can select 5 and asking the Wrangler to keep those 5 and delete everything else. So this will make it a little bit faster to work with large data sets like this. And of course, there are many smaller improvements like usability changes in the Wrangler that I am not presenting here. The next thing that we've done is we've refreshed the look and feel of data apps so that it's more consistent with our latest updated visual style. So it's still the same and it works. For example, the catalog works the same and it presents the applications and so on. The output looks similar, but it has been optimized to give you a better experience when you are looking at the data output and when you are looking through the data app catalog. So it's nicer, and we've made a few smaller changes in the data apps too. Some additional changes are planned for the next releases, so you'll stay tuned for more changes in here. Now switching from the server to the designer, we've made quite a substantial upgrade to the aggregate component. Instead of what I would call the legacy aggregate, it can now actually do much more than just simple aggregations as before. It allows you to build metadata as you are going along, right? So you can see there's a UI in here, and I'll show you what it looks like in a couple of minutes. And it allows you to create your metadata as you go along instead of having you define the metadata before you do anything with the component. And on top of that, you can add aggregation conditions. So for example, on the screenshot here, you can see that I'm counting the small payments, right? All the amounts that are smaller than $500 are aggregated in the small payments, and for large payments, similarly, it would show in here for amount greater or equal to $500. So this is something that you were able to do in Clover even before, but either you had to use multiple aggregate components and filters and then joins at the end, which is oftentimes very slow and complicated, or code it by yourself in something like denormalizer. So all of that can now be created in a simple interface without any coding at all, and just writing conditions if you have any such conditional application for your aggregation rules. So overall, the component is more powerful than it was before, and it's more useful in many circumstances where you would have to resolve the issue with the code before. Additionally, we've added an option for what I would call zero record, meaning that if nothing goes into the aggregate, it can still produce a single record on the output. So if you want to know that, for example, your dataset contains 0 records, now it's very easy with aggregate. It was much harder before because you had to use various tricks with multiple components to get that kind of functionality. Another change on the server is that we've improved the navigation on the server. We have a new page called Home that lists all the applications that you have access to, like, for example, Wrangler, Data Manager, Data Apps, and so on. And this is something that you get to see when you log into the server. So you don't have to remember different login pages for all the applications, but there's a single login that your end users can go to. It's /Clover/home by default. You can go there and you will see the applications that you have access to. And so the content in here will change depending on the permissions of the user who logged in to the server. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've worked on the Kubernetes. So we've introduced a number of examples that are available in our Docker repository. For now, we are publishing 2 examples, let's say the simpler ones. The first one is a single server example that allows you to or that shows you how to deploy a standalone CloverDX server instance. This is something that we see our customers asking for quite often. So the settings in here in the example are reasonable, right? So you can run this in production, for example, if you want. Obviously, you will want to change the size of the instance and so on, depending on the requirements. But all the rest of the settings should be useful. So this is not configured as a toy that you would just play with and then ignore, but this is something that you can actually use to run some serious workloads if you give it enough resources. Similar logic is behind the clustering example. So we have published an example that allows you to create a cluster of any size. By default, it's configured to be a cluster of 3 servers, but you can just change a constant within the YAML file to a larger number and then give you more. And this is, again, an example of how you can configure the cluster in Kubernetes easily so that it runs well and you don't have to fine-tune anything else besides the sizing of your pods to give you the performance that you require. We plan to add more examples with additional stuff like, for example, load balancers or proxies and so on, so that we can show you how many of our customers are deploying Clover in different situations, especially with regards to securing the platform when you are running it in cloud, because this is more and more important to more and more of our customers. We've made many smaller improvements in the designer itself. For example, there's a new component palette, which you'll see when I show you the designer. The new palette is much easier to navigate when you have large number of components. This is a situation you get into when you are using a lot of libraries. And in the previous version of Clover, if you had 3 or 4 libraries, it was still fine. But if you had 10 or so, it started to be very cumbersome. So with the new palette, it's still familiar interface, but it's much easier to navigate. We've improved the LookupTableReaderWriter component to propagate metadata on input and output ports. So this will make it much easier for you to build jobs that work with lookups. You no longer have to explicitly define the metadata. You simply pick the lookup in the component and it will know what kind of metadata it requires or what kind of metadata to publish. We've improved content assist for CTL. This is something that you'll see most often when you are doing something a little bit more complex because it handles local variables, constants, and record types much better. It will offer content assist in many cases where it didn't before. So it will be easier for you to navigate your code, especially if you are using all kinds of imports and so on. This will help you much more compared to the previous versions. We are also introducing 4 new CTL functions. 3 of them, the last 3 on the list in here, are validation functions that essentially replicate the functionality of the Wrangler validation steps. And so the same thing that you have as a step in Wrangler, you can now do with a CTL function if you need that kind of functionality in a Clover job, not on a Wrangler job. And we also added the get day of week convenience function to just get you which day a specific date is, instead of having to use a formatting string to get the same kind of information. There are many other changes that I wanted to mention, just 3 of them. The configuration of the cluster has been simplified. This is actually something that allowed us to build those Kubernetes examples more effectively than what was possible before. If you know how the cluster works, there is a setting called initial hosts that's sometimes difficult to configure, especially if you are using some sort of a dynamic way to start your cluster. And so you are using some sort of like infrastructure as code tooling that starts your service somewhere, right? You have a number of hosts and they get new IP addresses, new everything every time they run. So this was difficult to create. You had to have scripts as part of your deployment. Now, this is not necessary at all. You can completely ignore that setting. Clover will figure it out by itself by essentially knowing which database to connect to. Right? So the settings will now be stored in database rather than in a file, which allows the cluster nodes to effectively communicate and figure out the settings for this automatically without you having to do anything. You can, of course, still configure that if you need to for some reason, and all the other cluster settings are there still as well, but most of them you don't need to configure anymore. We've improved the import and export for sandbox configuration. It's now easier to import sandboxes on a different machine because it imports it exports also the sandbox name. which it didn't do before. There was a reason for that, because it was expected that the sandboxes would be initialized maybe with a different name somewhere else, but this seems not to be the use case that people use it for, so we've changed the functionality. The export and import files are still the same, so they are backwards and forward compatible with what you had before, so you don't have to re-export the stuff that you had there before. It will still work. And we've added a new REST API to query users in the system. This is something that we often see in large organizations who want to know which users are known to the server. So we have a new API for that. We'll be adding more endpoints to REST API in the future as well. So stay tuned here too. All right, so that was quite a lot of slides. Let's now have a look at the demo. And I'll start with the data manager. As I mentioned, we have a new login screen that allows you to very easily see which apps you have available. So I'll go to the data manager. And the data manager itself works with a very simple concept that we call a data set. So as a user, you have access to any number of data sets that you can create. If you are administrator, you can create data sets. This is driven by permissions. So different people can see different data sets in here. And data sets is essentially a set of rows, right? You can have any layout. You can look, for example, at the layout of your data set over here. I have a data set that represents the real estate listings. It has, I think, about 40 or so columns, 47, that represents stuff like, where the listing is, the location, the price, the square feet, how many stories, buildings, and so on. Right. So essentially stuff that you would expect for your real estate property to have. As I mentioned before, you can have different user roles, right? You can have different people have permissions that allow them to edit data, approve data, or be administrators who can change, for example, the layout or create new data sets and so on. So you can fine tune to the person, right? So this is no longer based on groups like the permissions in the server, but rather on specific people. You can configure who will have which permissions with your data. So let me go back to the data set. So as I mentioned, data set is essentially a table with your data. You can load the data into it through any number of Clover jobs. I'll show you what they look like. Then the data essentially stored in the data manager while the users work on it. And then when the users are ready, the data can be pulled from the data manager again with a CloverDX job or multiple jobs if you want to, and can be processed further. The data can be anything, right? So my data set has about 40 columns. Not all of them are shown in here. I can change that, and we have a UI that allows me to hide and show various columns that might be important for me or not. I only am showing subset of them. But the most important part is that you can work with the data directly. So if I wanted to change something, for example, let's find something that was flagged as an error over here. Right, I have a number of addresses that are broken. For example, this has an invalid zip code and there's a state missing in here. So to resolve that, I would of course have to look at the map because I have no idea where Davenport is or what kind of zip code it is from memory. But let's just say that I know, and I can type in something here. The data will be immediately saved. I can see that it was modified by myself, right? We keep full audit record of all the data changes. And of course, for states, we can show you the list of states. I don't know. Let's make it New Mexico. Again, I don't know which Davenport this would be. What Data Manager also has is that when you submit data to it, instead of just submitting raw record like this, you can submit what we call suggestions. So the job that processes the data before it gets to this interface can perform various enrichments, and it might know something. For example, based on a zip code or a name of the state, it can figure out which state is the most likely to be the correct one, right? For example, one of these three. Again, I don't know off the top of my head, but if I did, I would be able to select this faster. And you can, for example, work with confidence intervals in here and all kinds of other things. Essentially, anything you can create in Clover can play into the suggestions in here so that you can offer something to help users. Oh, and I'm also missing a price in here. So let's say that this costs $500,000. All the changes are tracked. And what's interesting is that the records that are in the data manager they have multiple different statuses as they progress through the system. So the orange one in here, kind of yellowish, those are new rows that have been submitted and no one has worked or approved them. Then we have what we call edited. This is a status after the editor has taken care of it. So I'm now in the role of editor. And if I want to say to someone, okay, I have fixed the problems on this row and I think it's fine, I can just press in here and you'll see that the counter in here will increase, right, in the blue section of my data, and I'll see the status is changing here too. Then the next status is called approved. This is when you have someone who is in the approver role. That person comes in and reviews the data managed or updated by the editor, and they can go in and approve. Or of course, if you feel that the data is fine, you can approve many records at once simply by selecting many of them and approving all of them at once. Right. So in this way, you work with your data directly. You can search through the table either as a global search or through columns. You can filter them and so on. And so there are all kinds of features that allow you to work with your data to find what you need to do, and then either edit the data directly, approve it, and so on. You can also delete rows if you don't want to process that one. Right? If this is, for example, completely broken and cannot be fixed, I can mark it as deleted. And again, this is all audited, right? So I'm not actually deleting the data. I'm just telling the data manager that I don't want to process this record further. So once I'm done with this, let's say that the deletion is fine. So I want to approve the deletion. And me being in an approver role, I can do all of that. But if I had just a limited role, I wouldn't see all of the actions in here, right? I might not be able to, for example, approve the data if I'm just an editor. So let's say that I managed all of my data in here in the data manager, and now it's time to submit the data further. And this is something that happens in the designer, or rather in a regular CloverDX job. So I'm going to show you what that one looks like. So I have a job in here that loads approved rows to a warehouse. And we have new components that work with the data manager data. For now, they are in the incubation category, so they are very easy to find. There are 3 components called dataset reader, dataset writer, and dataset commit. The dataset reader is the component that you use to read data from your dataset. It has a very simple configuration. You just select the dataset and you can change the status that you want to get and so on. And since Clover already knows what kind of data layout it is, it can tell me what metadata to publish. Right? So this is the metadata that I'm getting back. Then I have a job that writes to warehouse, and the commit tells the system that whatever I was supposed to do in here worked. So this is also allowing you to work in situations where you have to call, for example, an API, and that call might not succeed all the time, either because you are trying to submit data that just isn't acceptable to the API, and it's still incorrect even though you have changed it in the data manager, or maybe you weren't able to call the API and it's offline, or something is wrong with the network or something else. So you read your data, you process it in any way you want, typically sending to some sort of a downstream system, and then you commit. And when you do this, you can run this job in any number of ways. You can run it from the designer, but typically what you want to do is you can actually schedule that as a job on the server, right? It's just a normal job using components. I'll run it manually for now. And what we'll see is that once I come back, all the approved rows will change to what we call committed, which means that they have been processed and they are now done. Once a row is committed, let's see, it should be done already. Once a row is committed, it cannot be edited, right? Even when it's approved, I can still edit that, but when something's committed, which I'll see after refresh, you see there are 40 committed rows. So once it's committed, clicking into it, right, I'm trying to click and cannot edit anything. So this is what was sent to the downstream system. And being an editor or approver, again, of course, means that I can go and continue working on my data further. And when I run the job again, it will pick up more rows that have been processed and so on. And so in this way, essentially, you are kind of stopping your automated process in the middle, waiting with the process for the people to do whatever they need to make sure that the data has been corrected or reviewed, approved. And once you're ready with that, you can start an automated process that takes the data further. And as I mentioned before, you can start a job in any way, right? So for example, I have a data app that allows me to do that. And this one, it just calls a job. Well, I don't have any approved record, I think, so this is not going to change. But you can trigger that in any way, so you can build your automation the way that you are used to. So you can still, for example, ingest your data regularly every couple minutes or every day or whatever your use case requires. You can have people working here as long as they want, right? They can take any number of days to fix it. Sometimes it might be difficult to figure out what's that, because you might even have to call someone, for example, to figure out the answer to something. And once you are ready, you can start the job that picks up the data, or you have it scheduled, and again, it will just pick up the records as they are approved by the users in the data manager. Now, of course, the data manager kind of touches all parts of the platform, and so we have the new interface that allows you to work with the data itself. You can work with the manager from data apps, from Wrangler, but there's also a new screen in the data in the Clover console that shows you the data sets as well, so that the administrator who doesn't have to have access to the data, which is common in many organizations, that you have people who manage the platform but can't see the data. So for the admin, we have a simple view that shows the admin how much data is maintained in here, what's the retention period, and so on. Right? So basic properties. You can disable the data set. Right? Being an admin, I can do this, which means that any job that tries to write to it or read from it will fail. It will simply say data set is disabled, and you will have to work with the administrator to enable it again. So I have shown you how you can read data from data set, and writing to it is just as simple as this, right? There's a new component called dataset writer that's used just like this, right? You have something that reads your data, validates, and so on. It doesn't matter what it is. I'm using subgraphs for it because there's a bit more work behind it, but it doesn't matter. The dataset writer is a simple component to use. You select dataset to write to. You have the ability to map if you want to change metadata as it goes in. But that's it, right? So I can run this. Again, this is something that typically you would run automatically, or from a data app. You can have a data app where you drop a file and it gets loaded into a data set and so on. And let's see what I have in here. And I have 200 records. This is the data that I will be sending to the data manager. And this is the interesting part at the end, where you can see the suggestions and the errors reported by the system, right? So the validation in here, reports all the issues in here as a simple variant. So it's very easy to work with this and provide new values that you want to suggest for the data manager to display. And if I go back into the data manager and refresh, right, I have I don't know, 170 roughly rows in my data manager, and I think I loaded 200 more. So let's see, 315 new rows in here. Yep. So in this way, you can load your data, process in the data manager, and download after you are done. All right, so that was the data manager, and then there's only one more thing that I wanted to show you, and that's the aggregation component. So I'll show you a simple job that shows the difference between the old one and the new one, right? Let me run this so that we can see the data. Essentially, what I'm reading is payments data. It's a very simple structure. I have an ID, order ID, customer ID, what kind of payment it is, the amount, and a transaction date. And what I want to do is to aggregate the amounts per customer, right? So for each customer ID, I want to know how much they pay with different ways they can pay, whether it's a card, there should be a cash somewhere in here, or wire. And in previous versions of Clover, this is what you had to do. You essentially use denormalizer, and the code in here is not complicated, but it's still coding, right? If you've been using Clover for a while, this is something you can do very quickly, but it's still fairly annoying. With new aggregate, what you can do is configure all of that in the aggregation. Basic interface looks the same, and you have still the same properties like the aggregation key, mapping, and so on, but the difference is in how the mapping works. Where you have a more complex interface that allows you to see your input fields, the output fields can be modified. So I can, for example, add a new field in here, saying, I don't know, small amounts. Let's make it long, and let's count how many amounts are smaller than, I don't know, $100. Right. So in this way, I have created a new field in my metadata, and I can change what's in there. So let's paste it on. No, actually, I don't need input. I need this. I need count. And the functions are familiar to you, and these are the same that you had there before. And in CTL editor, I can specify the condition for my data. So let's say that I want the payment, the paid amount to be smaller than 100. And this way I have created a condition which will apply the count and will count just the amounts smaller than $100. Right, and in this way, it's very easy to do. If I wanted to do the same in denormalizer, I would have to go and modify the metadata first, then go into the code here, put in the code to calculate whatever I did, and then I'll have the same result. But with this one, it's much faster. I can create all of that into user interface. So more powerful aggregate that allows you to apply conditions as you are working with your data, right? And this person had one small transaction, and you can see some numbers in here. So this is the new aggregate. It replaces the previous one. So we don't have two aggregate components in here. There's just one that has the new functionality, right? It's an extension of the previous functionality. So you don't have to worry about not supporting what you've built before. And as I mentioned, there's also one new function in here, zero count record, that applies when you read nothing. So if I add a filter in here and throw away all data, let's do that. And let's make sure that nothing is written to the target. So let's do false as my statement. So all the data will be thrown away, and the denormalizer will not produce anything on the output because it doesn't get anything. So it can't. But the aggregate will tell me, oh, well, there was no data in here. So all the values will be empty or zero, depending on what function I used. And so this is what we call a zero record. It's either empty or zeros, or depending on what you do in here. And something like this is difficult to replicate in Clover without this aggregator functionality, because you have to use multiple components to get that.